It is 1842. The United States Navy in its early decades, and an incident that is remembered as a mutiny. Sailing the Graveyard Sea, the deathly voyage of the Somers, the U.S. Navy's only mutiny, and the trial that gripped the nation. Richard Snow is the author. I welcome you, Richard. I congratulate you. Your book is a fascination, not the
Thank you.
least, because it becomes suggestively the inspiration for two of Melville's masterpieces. Herman Melville also went to sea and had a relation with the crew of Somers. One is White Jacket, the other, of course, the famous and unfinished and much debated Billy Budd. The man who is the, if we're not taking too much liberty with Melville's memory, who may be an inspiration for Billy Budd, is named Philip Spencer. He's born 1824. Richard, what do we need to know about Philip Spencer as we proceed him towards boarding the Somers? Good evening to you.
Good evening. Thank you. Well, the great naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison felt he only needed to sum him up by saying he was a young punk. And there is some truth to that, although if every adolescent boy who was a young punk hanged for it, the race would die out. But he was a very difficult child and unruly student. He had the misfortune to have a father who was both tremendously intelligent, one of the foremost lawyers of his day, and with a savage temper and a scorn for all human frailty. And Philip was sort of a dreamer, and he withdrew. And he was. This is long before the Western bad man began shooting things up. But so he withdrew into a popular literary genre of the time, which were stories about pirates. He read about pirates. The only constructive thing he seems to have done when he was in school was to donate to the school library a 400-page monolith called The Pirate's Own Book. And he kept screwing up in school, and his father, despairing, wanted to, send him somewhere to shape him up. There was some talk about his being a dragoon on the Western frontier, but boy, for a restless, unhappy teenager, that didn't seem like a good. But in a ship, well, you were always under discipline. People were always looking at you. Nothing could go wrong there. And he got him a berth in the Navy. And he came aboard his first ship as a junior midshipman, which was the lowest real rank in the service. And he did not make himself popular. He hid liquor around the vessel. He was scornful, uncommunicative, surly, and he got himself transferred to another ship, and then he got in trouble there too. And the Navy was going to dump him, but he wrote a very mature and eloquent letter. He was no dope, saying how remorseful he was and how he wanted one more chance. And he got it. And he got it on quite an unusual ship. This was the USS Somers. She was one of the prettiest ships ever built in America. And the last to be powered by sail power alone, no steam engine. But she was small, a brig-of-war, 100 feet long, 70 feet, 20 feet wide. And she had brand new and had been taken over as the Navy's first experiment with actually educating its officers and sailors. She was the first school ship. Before that, It had just been throw them in the water and see if they can swim.
All right,
And
we've got Philip to the Somers. A couple of
yes,
details that emerge from your very careful telling. He has a disability. He's born with he's wall-eyed. He's born with a disability. He takes an operation to correct it, which is only partially effective. It helps his seeing, but he has a cast to his eye. So when talking to him directly, it can appear to superstitious eyes that he's casting an evil eye, or in some fashion presenting a face that is not trustworthy. Also, at the same time, you mentioned his pirate thinking. He's a daydreamer. He makes things up. And at one time, he makes up a fraternity that's still with us, Chi Psi. And
mhm.
the way he invents Chi Psi is they invent a list of people who can join and who cannot. It strikes me that it's important here because it's not at all too far to go from a list about Chi Psi to a list about a pirate ship. He is a convincing speaker as well. Did he boast of how he tells stories and how people listen to him? Was that part of his life?
Oh yes, he was, but he was also very fussy about who he talked to. So there only people worthy of listening to him would get to hear him. So he he was never very popular, except among the members of the fraternity he founded, which is still active on 32 campuses or something. It's his only monument to the guy.
Importantly, the pirate ship, as you say, it was the popular fiction of the time. Today we have superheroes, we have TV, we have video, all of that for the imagination of young people who are moving around and learning how to move into a world of adults. So let's go to the adults in this tragedy. Chief among them, the commander of Somers. His name is Mackenzie, but it's important to understand how he got that name because he's born Slidell. Why is he called Captain Mackenzie?
He is called Captain Mackenzie because he had an uncle in Scotland who had no children and was getting very worried that his name would die out, a thought that was unhappy to him. So he struck a deal with with Slidell and said, "Look, you take my name, and I'll give you my inheritance. You'll have a lot of money." And so uh, it happened quickly. Lieutenant Slidell disappeared and became, at that same instant, Lieutenant Mackenzie. And he kept his part of the bargain and carried the name, got the money, nice home on the Hudson, and was very happy with that outcome.
And a home on the Hudson near the farm of Washington Irving, because earlier in his life, Alexander Slidell had the good fortune of running into or meeting when he was out taking a year off from the Navy, Washington Irving, extremely famous author at this time, in both America and Europe. And Washington Irving takes him under his wing as an assistant because Irving's writing a book about Christopher Columbus, and here is a Navy man to help him with the terms of sailing the ocean blue. And they become friends and confidants. Strikingly, though, Irving helps him write a bestseller. Again and again, Richard, I'm struck by the prose that Mackenzie writes. He has a very high opinion of his prose, but it's extremely difficult to read.
Oh, it's clotted and always interrupted with a salute to the flag or to himself.
He did not write A Year in Spain. Irving wrote it. Can we agree on this?
Oh, I was near as damn it, yeah. And
But the Navy doesn't know that. So it's in every in every wardroom in the Navy,
it's
along with
amazing. Yeah, and it became a bestseller.
while he was at sea, he had no idea that it was being sent up the flag in Europe and America. He sells lots of copies. He's already independently wealthy. He's well married, and he has a good marriage. He's at sea, everything seems to be for his rise to being a famous American author, except for that's not real, and a famous American captain, except for he has a peculiarity, a weakness, or a tragic detail. That's the nature of tragedy. He's violent. He's a flogging captain. Why? Where does it come from? You talk about him witnessing executions. What attracts him?
I don't know. And it's something that when I first saw that he'd written all these travel books and not wonderfully readable, I was sort of miserable. I thought, oh, hell, I was too stupid at first to realize that what an immense advantage it was if I was trying to figure out a mid-19th century naval officer's character, to have hundreds of pages in his own voice, all in the first person. And what came out to me was that he's very rigid and proper. He's very worthy of the God that reigns above him and this and that. But he has a taste for violence that he writes about with almost lubricious, slightly pornographic detail. He goes to he hears there's a hanging in Spain. He goes to it. Then he writes a pious little thing about how disgraceful it was and how this could not. He'll never do this again. And 3 weeks later, he's back at another one. 3 weeks later, he's back at another one, and always telling exactly the last squirm and groan of the victim. And this is really not like any memoir I've ever read before. It's sandwiched with, boring obviousnesses, but he always comes back to a microscopic discussion of human suffering.
Yes, I could not read the garroting. I skipped it. And you weren't giving us the whole detail, just quotes from it. He witnesses it, and he talks about the tightening of the screw. He becomes a flogging captain, which unless you know it, unless you read your book, I would have assumed cynically was commonplace. It wasn't. He was singled out in the U.S. Navy. There was a pamphlet published by a sailor saying, "Watch out for this captain. He's one of the bad ones."
Yes, and when he got back from his cruise with Philip Spencer, the commandant of the New York Navy Yard, who was no shrinking violent, was absolutely horrified when he saw the records of the floggings of teenage boys on this cruise. And he said he was Mackenzie was very careful to stay inside of the limits of the law. You were only allowed to give 12 lashes, but that he still was able to accomplish more in this grim way than anyone he'd ever heard of, and he thought he didn't deserve to keep his command.
Let's get on board Somers. It's September 1842. We're about to set sail for a cruise to Africa and back with a lot of young men on board, midshipmen. Before there was a naval academy, this was understood to be an educational process. The book is Sailing the Graveyard Sea, The Deathly Voyage of the Somers, the U.S. Navy's only mutiny, and the trial that gripped the nation. Richard Snow is the author. We're on board Somers. It's September, setting sail from New York Harbor. It's built in Brooklyn, so this is its home port. And it's to go to the Madeira, onto the African coast, turn around and come back via St. Thomas, and come back sometime at the end of the year. It's a beautiful ship. Everybody admires it. It's very fast. Richard observes that it's probably the fastest thing on the ocean the U.S. Navy has. And it's over-rigged, which means you have to be careful when you rig it. It'll try to go faster and faster, and that can lead to the sails tumbling down upon the deck. It's overgunned. It's got 10 32-pounders on board, but it's little. Flush deck, I think that's what they call it, Richard.
And
So
yep,
there's no
great from stem to stern.
There's no quarterdeck. There's no raised part of the ship where the officers live. And there's only one Marine on board. And as you said, it's 100 feet long and about 25 feet wide. So it's little, and it's got it's got a crew now of 120, only 30 of whom seem to be mature sailors. Everybody else is a midshipman. And what were the midshipmen supposed to do, these boys between the ages of, I guess, 11 and 18? What was their task on board?
They had light tasks, but it was basically, this was to teach them the rudiments of being sailors. So they were, supposed to learn and supposed to be taught by the older members of the crew. I mean, just being on a ship will teach you an awful lot about it, and this was the first systematic attempt to educate sea officers for the United States. But it was very crowded. They were very young, and this Philip Spencer was from the start not at all helpful. He was in a society where almost all the other young midshipmen were either related by blood or by friendship to the higher officers and the captain, and he knew no one there. And his combination of his chilly approach to people and his slightly scary gaze kind of isolated. So I started palling around with the crew, which was something you weren't supposed to do in the 1840s. And
Remember now, Philip Spencer is a rich man's son. Also, John Spencer is the Secretary of War. So everybody knows this is a special person. He's got money to throw on the deck and to buy brandy and tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
So
all of which is forbidden.
So when we come back, we're going to plunge into the dramatic moments where this becomes from a boys' cruise to deadly. The book is Sailing the Graveyard Sea. Richard Snow is the author. It is Friday, the 24th of November. A man named Wales, the purser's steward, is approached by Philip Spencer, the 18-year-old daydreamer, who has notions of being a pirate, just like the pirate's own book that he read when he was in college. And he tells Wales, "Are you going to join us?" And he explains the plot. Richard, what is the plot as we understand it now, 180 years later?
Well, he said to first he says to Wales, "Hey, come with me. Come up here." And this tiny ship has only one place of real privacy, which looks like a wood pile. It's these spare spars all stacked in the middle of the deck, and they crawl up on top of them. And then Philip Spencer says that he's got at least 20 people on the ship recruited for his plan. They're going to be a great pirate ship. They can outgun anything half their size. They can outrun anything they have to, and we'll swing the guns around. We'll get the whole crew on deck at gunpoint. Then we'll decide which ones we need. The others will go overboard. A lot of useless mouths to feed, too many children, and then we'll go sailing and become rich. Big ships. Are you with me? I'm going to make you one of my officers. And Wales believes this, and out of sheer self-preservation says, "Oh yes, that's a great idea, Phil," and then waits through a miserable night to run and tell the captain. And he can't get at the captain, but he goes to the first lieutenant, Gansevoort, and tells him the whole story. And Gansevoort, of course, directly goes to Captain Mackenzie and says, what's up? And for a very little while, and for the only time, Mackenzie behaves like a rational grown-up. He says, he says, this is ridiculous. What, this twerp is going, what is going to have the ship rise up against me? He must be amusing himself with pirate stories. He even said that.
A detail. Who is Gunsavard at this point? The lieutenant. What do we
He's
need?
a number. He's the second in command, the lieutenant, and he's also, as you mentioned earlier, Herman Melville's first cousin, who convinced Herman Melville to go to sea and see what he found there. And but then, and it really only seems to be a matter of a few hours, the captain gets more and more frightened and more convinced. And he sets Gansevoort out to follow Spencer around and see what he's doing and spy on him, which isn't something that's easy to do on something the size of a city bus. And he begins to panic. And of course, a panicky captain will not have a lot of trouble passing that along to any of his subordinates.
Here's a detail, Richard, that struck me. On reading sailing ships over the years, a captain is God, all powerful. What a captain says must happen. You don't have a choice. You can't say no to a captain. Gansevoort knows this, so he tells the captain. And the captain doesn't hesitate. He makes rules on the basis of what is best for the service right then. Mackenzie doesn't do that. He holds back. He almost broods. And there's some time before he has Spencer brought to him. Is almost a delay, as if he's, as you say, he's going from being an adult to getting caught up in this fantasy. There's nothing that supports the fantasy to see. It's a little bitty ship. You can walk the whole thing in a couple of minutes. So when he has Mackenzie, when Mackenzie has Spencer brought to him, this is the 25th on a Saturday. What is the exchange like? This is Mackenzie's point of view, because that's the record we have.
Mackenzie coming out in the open with it now. It's been a couple of days, and there's Mr. Spencer, sir. I understand that you desire to have command of this ship. Oh, no, sir. I understand that you have told people that you were going to take over the ship. Well, maybe I did, but that was just a joke. And the captain forecast the future right there, as saying, well, it's not a fit subject for joking. That is a joke that could cost you your life. And he has him put in the irons. And from that moment on, he is always suspicious of everyone. He soon has two other sailors.
Yes, let's go to boatswain's mate Cromwell.
Yes.
Why is the captain suspicious of Cromwell and also Smalls? Why is he those two men? What singles them out? Because
Cromwell is the toughest guy on the ship, and he sails very close to the wind with his captain. He's going to be very rude to him. He's abrasive. Nobody likes him. He shrieks at everybody. He's a good boatswain's mate in that he can scare you into doing what he wants you to. But even the officers are nervous about him. So that may have had something to do with why he was picked. And Small is mysterious. He was popular. Everybody liked him. He was small. He was the shortest person on the ship. So he wasn't a very imposing or frightening figure. And looking back on it, I wonder if the reason that those two were chosen are that they were the only men on the ship who knew navigation. That they alone could have, if they had the ship and no officers on it, could have sailed somewhere that they wanted to. And
the Isle of Pie.
Anyway, they're both arrested and put in chains too.
All right, on the Sunday, we've got 3 men in irons now on the deck because there's no place else to put them. It's a flush deck ship. The captain and the officers do the best they can going below deck. Aft, the boys are all in a very narrow space under, there's a narrow deck about 4 feet high underneath the main deck. It's very crowded all the time. It's on the 26th, and there's an incident in which the rigging is carried away. They're sailing along at 7 knots. Morrison, more than 100 years later, finds that episode suspicious. In that he believes that Small was responsible or in some fashion responsible, but Small is at this point in irons. That's what's odd about this. The whole story of why the captain becomes suspicious and increasingly what we would use the word paranoid. It doesn't make sense to read all this time later, except for what you discovered from the publisher Bennett of the Herald after the ship goes to shore. I mean, after the ship lands again in New York and we begin the investigation. It was a moment of insanity, collective insanity. Does that make sense to you, Richard?
Very much so. That it seems like a paranoia, but the extreme paranoia that spills over into hysteria. I simply think that people once they got the idea that on this bizarre crew of kids were somehow going to band together, and their captain was clearly by now believing it. Gansevoort, all the officers had been patrolling all night fully armed, which they're carrying 40 pounds of equipment and it gets tiring. I mean, so people are tired, they're nervous, and the captain is beginning to say in all of his accounts that he can recognize what's happening, but by the terrible glare people are giving one another. Well, there he's coming right back to poor wall-eyed Philip Spencer and reading everything in scary looks. I mean, he's sure enough about that as a barometer to put it in his official reports. So everybody's a little crazy.
Now Mackenzie does something that's both clever and suspicious. Self-authenticating. He doesn't make decisions. He asks his wardroom to make decisions, quite separate from him. And all of the officers, Gansevoort, the acting master, all of them, young and old, gather together and hold what appears to be a court-martial, but it's not. It's an investigation with the weight of the captain, and they call in the crew, and the crew doesn't understand what's going on, so they make negative remarks about Cromwell, Small, not much about Spencer because they don't care that much about him, but Cromwell and Small were part of the crew.
And they're also pretty sure that this is what their captain wants.
Yes.
But
it's not, you make the very careful point. No one but the Navy has a right to call a court-martial. The captain doesn't. It's not his authority. And so it's like a court-martial, but it's not. And then they deliver a verdict. What do they tell the captain they've decided?
That for the safety of the vessel, Spencer, Small, and Cromwell have to die. They're near the Virgin Islands now. They're a few hours from fortified land. They could do, but it's come full cycle. The captain has gotten the verdict that he was clearly looking for, and they're going to act on it.
The book is Sailing the Graveyard Sea, The Deathly Voyage of the Somers and the U.S. Navy's Only Mutiny and the Trial that Gripped the Nation, Richard Snow. Spencer, 18 years old. Cromwell, 30 years old. Small, indeterminate, or dead. The Navy holds what is an inquiry, not a court-martial, an inquiry into these events beginning in January. And one very famous author, Richard Dana, who will later on become a very prominent name during the Civil War. He's already famous because he's written 2 years before The Mast, which is a astonishing good seller in America at the time. He writes brilliant prose. He goes on board the USS North Carolina. No, just the North Carolina. They don't use USS yet. He goes on the North Carolina where the hearing is being held. And Dana is partial to Mackenzie. What does he write, Richard, to favor Mackenzie?
He is with Mackenzie right along. He says what everybody was saying about Mackenzie in the beginning, before the more facts began to come out, that he's a gentle, more honorable man, never drew breath on the quarter deck of an American ship, that he is saintly and is and infinitely wise. Dana's for him all the way through and thinks that anybody who isn't is sort of scoundrel. And he remains deeply loyal to. I mean, they had the two men had no connection, but he was recognized as an expert on maritime affairs, and it meant something that he was sure that Mackenzie had behaved properly at every moment.
The inquiry is headed up by Commodore Stewart of Old Ironsides, and the prosecutor, or the representative of the court, is Ogden Hoffman, an attorney at the time. This is not a court-martial. It's not a coroner's investigation. The crime took place, or the actions took place at the sea. There's some confusion as to how this should go forward. Right before the inquiry finishes, Mackenzie brings forward his explanation for what happened. There are 6 items he mentions. I was convinced that Spencer was plotting to take over the ship and murder me and my crew. We were uncertain about the events, and we didn't have time to do a full investigation. We were at sea. We were exhausted from having to stay up all night and guard the whole ship from the unknown conspirators. There might have been a storm that would have overwhelmed us. We'd need the crew and we would have lost the ship. It was too small to make fast the prisoners. Eventually, there were 7 of them in addition to the earlier 3. And I felt that the execution would stop the mutiny. There was no mutiny defined that I can read, Richard, but that was his excuse at the time.
Yes.
The court of inquiry says that he's done right. Did they bless him? It's not a court. It's not a court martial. It's just an inquiry. Do they say we understand and submit the record? Is that what happened?
Yes, they said that he had behaved honorably and with justifiable audacity, and but it meant nothing in a way. It was just really a series of suggestions of what they felt about it. What they could not do anything punitive,
Right.
but that's why, rather surprisingly, Captain Mackenzie was wild to get a real court-martial which could pass judgment on him, and he was wild to do that because Philip Spencer's terrifying father, John Spencer, had met up with Seaman Small's wife, Margaret, and they were pushing very, very hard to get them in front of a civil judge in a New York City courtroom where they felt that a bunch of people in uniforms hanging a group of people would not sit as well with a jury of general New Yorkers as it would with their naval colleagues, and they were pushing for that. So Mackenzie was able to get the court-martial started fairly early, and
February 2nd to March 31st is the court martial.
Yes, and he got so he never did have to go in front of a bunch of New Yorkers.
And the court-martial itself is surprisingly filled with irregular events, including Mackenzie being absent 3 days and then producing a strange,
Yes.
strange record of what Spencer said to him the day of the execution. And the court is being supervised by three famous admirals, three famous captains, Downes of the Barbary Shore, Turner of the Lake Erie, and Reed of the Guerriere, the capture during the War of 1812. So Mackenzie emerges from this honorable and heroic, having rescued all these boys from the hands of the murdering Spencer. That was the verdict at the time? Is that correct, Richard?
Well, that's how they started. They they were going to acquit him honorably, but at this point, President Tyler intervened, and he couldn't change the verdict. He couldn't but he was damned if he wanted to say that this was an honorable action. He felt that Mackenzie should have been hanged as a murderer,
I
and
reckon.
so the president stepped in, and that was that took a lot of the wind out of Mackenzie's sails. I mean, he was going to live. He wasn't going to be tried for murder or anything. But he was a few days
Right.
before that came through. He'd asked a friend of his, the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, if he didn't want to write an epic poem about the
I reckon.
mutiny
I
and
reckon.
Mackenzie's role in it.
I,
After that, he didn't. He really never discussed it again.
I recommend sailing the Graveyard Sea for you to be the jury yourself and decide whether Mackenzie was correct or not in his decision. The deathly voyage of the Somers, the U.S. Navy's only mutiny, the trial that gripped the nation. Richard Snow is the author. I'm John Batchelor.